Bullies try to slap the new girl's cheek. Big mistake. She was a deadly fighter. 17-year-old Kira Valdez adjusted her oversized hoodie as she navigated the imposing corridors of Roosevelt High School, her third school in as many years. At 5 feet 2 inches with a petite frame that made her appear younger than her age, shoulder-length black hair that she kept deliberately unkempt to avoid attention, and dark brown eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses, Kira had perfected the art of being invisible. Her olive complexion bore no makeup, her clothes were deliberately baggy and unremarkable, and she carried herself with the careful posture of someone who had learned that drawing attention rarely led to anything good. What the 2,000 students and faculty of Roosevelt High didn't know, what nobody at any of her previous schools had ever discovered, was that beneath her unremarkable exterior lived one of the most dangerous teenagers in the state. Kira had been training in Krav Maga since she was 8 years old under her uncle Miguel, a former Israeli Defense Forces instructor who had immigrated to the United States after his military service. 9 years of intensive training had transformed her slight frame into a weapon of precise efficiency. Her muscle memory contained dozens of lethal combinations. Her reflexes had been honed to react faster than conscious thought, and her understanding of human anatomy allowed her to disable opponents 3 times her size with surgical precision. But Kira had learned through painful experience that revealing this aspect of herself only led to complications. At her first high school in Phoenix, she had defended herself against a group of seniors who had cornered her in the parking lot. The incident had resulted in 3 hospitalizations, a police investigation, and ultimately her family's decision to relocate when the harassment from the hospitalized students' friends became unbearable. At her second school in Denver, she had maintained her cover more successfully until a PE teacher noticed her unconscious defensive stances during a dodgeball game and began asking uncomfortable questions about her training background. Now, starting her senior year at Roosevelt High in the sprawling suburb of Millfield, California, Kira was determined to make it through 10 months without incident. Her father's construction company had finally landed a long-term contract that would keep them stable through her graduation, and her mother had found work as a nurse at the local hospital. For the first time in years, they weren't planning to move, which meant Kira couldn't rely on a convenient escape if things went wrong. Roosevelt High was a massive concrete and glass structure that had been built in the 1960s and expanded haphazardly over the decades. The original building housed the administrative offices and main classrooms, while newer wings contained the science labs, computer rooms, and arts facilities. The cafeteria was a cavernous space that could seat nearly 800 students, divided into informal territories that reflected the school's complex social hierarchy. The athletic facilities were impressive, featuring a competition-sized gymnasium, Olympic swimming pool, and football stadium that hosted games for 3 different high schools in the district. Kira had spent her first week carefully mapping the social landscape, identifying the key players and potential danger zones. The school's power structure was typical but particularly entrenched. At the top sat the senior class elite, a group of athletes and wealthy students who had been attending school together since elementary school. Below them were the various cliques: theater kids, honor society members, skaters, goths, and the large population of students who simply tried to blend in and survive until graduation. The undisputed rulers of Roosevelt High were a trio of seniors who called themselves the Trinity, though nobody seemed to remember how or when they had acquired this nickname. Their leader was Brandon Castellanos, 18 years old and built like the linebacker he had been before a knee injury ended his football career during junior year. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with broad shoulders, dark hair styled with expensive products, and the kind of symmetrical features that made teachers unconsciously favor him, Brandon possessed the natural charisma of someone who had never been told no. His father owned the largest construction company in the county, which meant Brandon drove a new BMW, wore designer clothes, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his future was secured regardless of his academic performance. Brandon's closest friend and lieutenant was Marcus Chen, a senior whose family had moved to Millfield from Hong Kong when he was 5 years old. Marcus stood nearly 6 feet tall, with an athletic build maintained through martial arts training that he used primarily for intimidation rather than sport. His black hair was cut in a modern style, and he favored expensive streetwear that reflected his family's wealth from their successful chain of restaurants. Marcus was known for his quick temper and his talent for psychological manipulation, finding precisely the right words to destroy someone's confidence or social standing. Teachers appreciated his academic performance and quiet demeanor in class, never witnessing the cruel brilliance he displayed in the hallways and parking lots. The third member of their triumvirate was Jessica Torres, a senior whose beauty was matched only by her viciousness. Standing 5 feet 7 inches with long blonde hair that she spent considerable time and money maintaining, green eyes that could shift from flirtatious to predatory in an instant, and a figure that made her the focus of attention wherever she went, Jessica was the kind of girl who had learned early that her appearance was a weapon to be wielded strategically. Her father was a prominent lawyer, and her mother had been homecoming queen at the same high school 20 years earlier, creating a legacy of expectation and entitlement that Jessica embraced fully. She was the undisputed queen of social media at Roosevelt, with thousands of followers who tracked her every outfit, relationship development, and public humiliation of those who crossed her. Together, the Trinity controlled Roosevelt High through a combination of charisma, intimidation, and strategic alliance building. They threw the parties that determined social status, decided which underclassmen would be accepted into their circle, and maintained their power through a carefully orchestrated system of rewards and punishments. Teachers either feared them or had been charmed into believing they were model students dealing with the normal challenges of adolescence. The administration had learned to handle them delicately, knowing that their parents' influence in the community could create problems for anyone who challenged their children too aggressively. For 2 weeks, Kira successfully avoided their attention. She arrived at school early to claim a locker in a less popular hallway, ate lunch in the library, where food was technically not allowed, but the librarian turned a blind eye to students who were quiet and cleaned up after themselves, and planned her routes between classes to avoid the main hallways during passing periods. She spoke only when spoken to in classes, completed her assignments competently but not brilliantly enough to draw attention, and politely declined the few social overtures made by classmates who seemed genuinely friendly. Her strategy was working perfectly until the incident in AP chemistry class during her 3rd week at Roosevelt. Kira was sitting in her usual spot near the back of the classroom, taking careful notes while Mr. Patterson explained molecular bonding, when Jessica Torres walked in 15 minutes late, wearing sunglasses and carrying a Starbucks cup despite the school's prohibition on both items. The teacher paused his lecture as Jessica made her way to her assigned seat in the front row, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor with deliberate slowness. "Miss Torres," Mr. Patterson said with barely concealed irritation, "perhaps you could join us for the remainder of today's lesson." Jessica smiled sweetly as she settled into her chair. Sorry, Mr. P had to handle some urgent business. She made no move to remove her sunglasses or dispose of her coffee. The teacher clearly wanted to press the issue, but seemed to think better of it, returning to his explanation of covalent bonds with visible frustration. Kira watched this interaction with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed similar power dynamics at multiple schools. Jessica's ability to disrupt class without consequences was impressive, though not particularly surprising, given what Kira had observed about the administration's handling of privileged students. The problem arose when Mr. Patterson began assigning lab partners for the day's experiment. He had a policy of rotating partnerships to ensure students worked with different classmates throughout the semester. And by cruel coincidence, Kira found herself paired with Jessica for the first time. Jessica looked over her shoulder at Kira with barely concealed annoyance. "Great," she muttered, loud enough for several nearby students to hear. "Guess I'm babysitting the charity case today." Kira gathered her materials and moved to the lab station Jessica had claimed, determined to complete the assignment with minimal interaction. She had learned that engaging with bullies only escalated situations, and she needed to maintain her low profile for 7 more months. "So," Jessica said, as they began setting up the equipment for their molecular modeling experiment, "you're the new girl everyone's been talking about." "I don't think anyone's been talking about me," Kira replied quietly, focusing on measuring chemicals with precise movements that betrayed none of her nervousness. Jessica laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Oh, honey, you're wrong about that. See, when someone new shows up at our school, especially someone who thinks they're too good to talk to people, we notice." Kira looked up briefly, meeting Jessica's eyes for the first time. Even through the designer sunglasses, she could see the calculating intelligence that made Jessica particularly dangerous among the school's predators. "I'm not trying to be rude to anyone. I just prefer to keep to myself." "That's your first mistake," Jessica said, taking out her phone and beginning to record despite the classroom's technology policy. "At Roosevelt, you're either part of the community or you're a problem, and right now you're looking like a problem." The chemical reaction they were monitoring began to change color, indicating the next phase of their experiment. Kira made note of the time and temperature while Jessica continued filming, occasionally making comments clearly intended for her social media followers rather than their lab work. "Check this out," Jessica said to her phone camera. "Working with our mysterious new student who's too cool for friends. What do you think, guys? Should we help her learn how to fit in?" She held the phone close to Kira's face, forcing her into the frame. "Please don't post anything with me in it," Kira said, her voice calm but firm. "I prefer not to be on social media." Jessica's eyebrows rose above her sunglasses. "Oh, you prefer? That's interesting. Do you hear that, everyone? The new girl has preferences about how we use our phones." Several students had begun watching their interaction, sensing the potential for drama that would enliven the otherwise mundane chemistry class. Mr. Patterson was helping another group with their setup and hadn't noticed the brewing conflict. "I'm just asking nicely," Kira said, returning her attention to their experiment. "We should record these measurements before the reaction progresses too far." "You know what I think?" Jessica said, moving closer and speaking loud enough for the observing students to hear clearly. "I think you're stuck up. I think you believe you're better than all of us, and that's why you won't make friends or join activities or even eat in the cafeteria like a normal person." Kira felt the familiar tension beginning in her shoulders, the unconscious preparation her body made when it sensed potential danger. She forced herself to relax, to maintain the carefully constructed persona of the shy, harmless new girl. "I'm not better than anyone. I just need time to adjust to a new school." 3 weeks isn't enough time. Jessica's voice carried the sweet venom that had made her reputation. "Or maybe the problem is that you think we're all beneath you. Maybe you're used to a better class of people wherever you came from." The accusation was so far from the truth that Kira almost smiled. Her family moved frequently because of her father's work, staying in extended-stay motels and small apartments, shopping at thrift stores, and planning meals around grocery store sales. She kept to herself, not from a sense of superiority, but from a learned wariness of getting attached to people she would inevitably leave behind. "That's not true," Kira said simply, making another notation about their experiment's progress. Jessica's phone was still recording as she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "You know what I think, new girl? I think you need an attitude adjustment. I think you need to learn how things work around here. The bell rang, indicating the end of class period, and students began cleaning their stations and gathering their belongings. Kira quickly recorded their final measurements and began putting away the lab equipment, hoping to escape before the situation escalated further. "We're not done talking," Jessica said as Kira gathered her books. "In fact, I think some of my friends would like to meet you, help you understand the social structure here." Kira shouldered her backpack and headed for the door without responding. But she could feel Jessica's eyes following her and knew with sick certainty that she had just made the kind of enemy she had been trying to avoid. As she walked to her next class, she noticed students looking at her with the speculative interest that suggested Jessica's social media post was already circulating. That afternoon, as Kira made her way to the library for her usual solitary lunch, she encountered her first direct confrontation with the Trinity's power structure. She was walking down the main hallway, keeping close to the lockers and avoiding eye contact, when she heard her name being called. "Hey, new girl, Kira!" She turned to see Marcus Chen approaching with two other students she recognized as members of the Trinity's extended circle. Marcus was smiling, but Kira had learned to read the subtle signs of predatory behavior, and nothing about his expression or body language suggested friendly intentions. "I'm Marcus," he said, extending his hand as if meeting her for the first time. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." Kira shook his hand briefly, noting the unnecessary firmness of his grip and the way he held the contact slightly longer than normal. "Nice to meet you," she said politely. "Jessica mentioned you guys had an interesting conversation in chemistry class today," Marcus continued, his tone conversational, but his eyes calculating. "She's concerned that maybe you're having trouble fitting in here." "I'm fine," Kira replied, "just focused on schoolwork." Marcus laughed, and his companions joined in with the kind of synchronized amusement that spoke to extensive practice in group intimidation. "That's exactly what Jessica said you'd say. See, the thing is, at Roosevelt, we take care of each other. We're like a family. And when someone new joins the family, we like to make sure they understand how things work." Kira felt the familiar hyper-awareness that preceded conflict, her senses automatically cataloging exit routes, potential weapons, and the positioning of the growing crowd of observers. She forced herself to maintain normal breathing and relaxed body language while her mind ran through defensive scenarios. "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but I'm really fine on my own." "Are you, though?" This came from one of Marcus's companions, a senior named Tyler, whose father coached the wrestling team. "Because from what I hear, you've been pretty antisocial, not eating in the cafeteria, not joining any clubs, not talking to people in your classes. That doesn't sound fine to me." The crowd around them was growing larger, drawn by the unmistakable tension of a developing confrontation. Kira noticed several students had their phones out, ready to capture whatever happened next for social media distribution. The hallway felt smaller, more confined, as more bodies pressed closer to get a better view. "Maybe she thinks she's too good for us," suggested the third member of their group, a girl named Ashley, whose primary qualification for Trinity membership seemed to be her enthusiastic participation in whatever cruelty they devised. "Maybe she's used to a higher class of people." Kira recognized the echo of Jessica's earlier accusations and realized this was a coordinated effort rather than a spontaneous encounter. The Trinity was methodically building a case against her, establishing a narrative that would justify whatever harassment they had planned. "That's not true," Kira said, hating how defensive she sounded. "I'm just shy." Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and see the careful calculation in his dark eyes. "You know what I think? I think you're playing hard to get. I think you want attention, but you want us to work for it." The suggestion was delivered with a smile that made Kira's skin crawl. She took a step backward, maintaining distance while scanning for the best escape route. The crowd had formed a rough circle around them, and she realized with growing concern that leaving without some form of confrontation was becoming impossible. "I really need to get to the library," she said, attempting to move around Marcus. He matched her movement, blocking her path with the casual ease of someone accustomed to controlling social situations. "The library will still be there in a few minutes. Right now, we're having a conversation." "I don't want to have a conversation," Kira said, allowing a note of firmness to enter her voice. "I want to eat lunch." Ashley laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Oh, now she's getting an attitude. Did you hear that, everyone? The new girl thinks she can tell us what she wants to do." The crowd murmured appreciatively, sensing that the encounter was approaching its climax. Kira felt the familiar calm beginning to settle over her, the mental state her uncle had taught her to recognize as the moment when violence became inevitable. Her body was already shifting into a more balanced stance, her weight distributed in a way that would allow for immediate movement in any direction. "Look," Marcus said, his smile widening as he sensed her growing tension, "we're just trying to be friendly here. All you have to do is apologize for being rude to Jessica, promise to make more of an effort to fit in, and maybe give us a little demonstration of how sorry you are." "What kind of demonstration?" Kira asked, though she suspected she already knew. Tyler cracked his knuckles with theatrical menace. "Nothing too dramatic. Maybe just get down on your knees and say you're sorry like you mean it. Show everyone that you understand your place here." The suggestion sent a wave of excited murmurs through the crowd. This was the kind of public humiliation that would be recorded, shared, and talked about for weeks. If Kira complied, her reputation would be destroyed and she would become a target for every predator in the school. If she refused, they would escalate until she was forced to defend herself, which would reveal abilities she had worked hard to keep hidden. "I'm not doing that," Kira said quietly. Marcus's expression shifted, the pretense of friendliness disappearing to reveal something colder and more dangerous. "That's disappointing. I was hoping we could handle this the easy way." He gestured to his companions, and Kira watched them begin to spread out in the practiced formation of people who had done this before. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised to capture every moment of her humiliation. She could see excitement in their faces, the primitive satisfaction that came from watching someone else's destruction. "Last chance," Marcus said. "Apologize to Jessica, get on your knees, and promise to be a good little transfer student. Or we help you understand why that would have been the smart choice." Kira looked around the circle of faces, seeing curiosity, excitement, and the kind of bloodthirst that emerged when teenagers sensed weakness. She thought about her parents, who had sacrificed stability and financial security to give her opportunities. She thought about the promise she had made to herself to graduate without incident. She thought about the 7 months remaining until she could escape this place forever. Then she thought about her Uncle Miguel's voice during one of their early training sessions. "There will come a time when avoiding conflict is no longer possible. When that moment arrives, you must choose between preserving your dignity and preserving your cover. Choose wisely, but never let anyone take your dignity without a fight." "I'm not apologizing," Kira said, her voice carrying a note of steel that made several nearby students take an unconscious step backward. "And I'm not getting on my knees for you or anyone else." Marcus's smile became genuinely ugly. "Wrong answer." He reached out to grab her shoulder, presumably to force her into the submissive position they had demanded. It was exactly the kind of mistake that Kira had been trained to exploit. The next few seconds unfolded with the precise choreography of violence that separated trained fighters from street brawlers. As Marcus's hand approached her shoulder, Kira stepped slightly to her left, while simultaneously grabbing his wrist with both hands. Using his own momentum against him, she pivoted and pulled downward while extending her leg to sweep his feet. Marcus, who outweighed her by nearly 60 pounds, found himself airborne for a brief moment before crashing to the linoleum floor with an impact that echoed through the suddenly silent hallway. Tyler, seeing his friend taken down, rushed forward with the kind of predictable aggression that made him effective on wrestling mats, but vulnerable in real combat. Kira ducked under his reaching arms and drove her elbow upward into his solar plexus with enough force to lift him onto his toes. As he doubled over, gasping for air, she grabbed the back of his head and brought her knee up to meet his face in a controlled strike that would cause pain and disorientation without breaking bones. Ashley, who had been expecting to watch rather than participate in violence, found herself suddenly facing an opponent who had just incapacitated two larger attackers in less than 5 seconds. She threw a wild slap at Kira's face, the kind of untrained strike that telegraphed its intention with obvious body language. Kira caught Ashley's wrist, twisted it into a painful compliance hold, and used the leverage to guide the taller girl face first into the nearest locker with a metallic crash that left a visible dent. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. Marcus was on the floor clutching his tailbone and trying to understand how he had gotten there. Tyler was sitting against the wall with blood streaming from his nose and tears in his eyes as he struggled to breathe normally. Ashley was slumped against her locker, conscious but dazed, with the beginnings of what would become an impressive black eye. Kira stood in the center of the circle, barely breathing hard, her backpack still secured and her glasses only slightly askew. The crowd stared at her in complete silence, phones forgotten, as their minds struggled to process what they had just witnessed. "I asked nicely to be left alone," Kira said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "I tried to avoid this, but since you insisted on making it physical, let me be very clear about something. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will defend myself. Every time. Against anyone." She looked around the circle of shocked faces, making eye contact with several students who had their phones raised. "I suggest you think very carefully before you decide to test that." The spell broke as teachers and administrators began pushing through the crowd, drawn by the commotion and the metallic crash of Ashley hitting the locker. Kira found herself facing Assistant Principal Rodriguez, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been breaking up fights at Roosevelt for over a decade. "What happened here?" Mrs. Rodriguez demanded, taking in the scene of 3 injured students and one apparently unharmed girl standing in the center of a crowd. Before Kira could respond, Marcus struggled to his feet with Tyler's help. "She attacked us," he said, his voice strained with pain and humiliation. "We were just trying to talk to her, and she went crazy." Several voices from the crowd began speaking at once, creating a chaos of conflicting accounts that made it impossible to understand what had actually occurred. Mrs. Rodriguez raised her hand for silence and turned to address the assembled students. "I want everyone who wasn't directly involved to get to class immediately," she announced. "Anyone with video footage of this incident needs to report to my office within the hour. Miss Valdez, you'll come with me now." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Kira found herself walking beside the assistant principal toward the administrative offices. She could feel the stares following her, hear the excited whispers as students began sharing their versions of what they had witnessed. By the end of the day, she knew the story would have spread throughout the entire school and probably beyond. "Miss Valdez," Mrs. Rodriguez said as they entered her office, "in my 15 years of dealing with student conflicts, I've rarely seen anything quite like what just happened out there. Would you care to explain how a girl your size managed to put 3 larger students on the ground in a matter of seconds?" Kira sat in the chair across from the assistant principal's desk and considered her options. She could lie, claiming that she had gotten lucky or that her attackers had simply been clumsy. She could tell part of the truth, admitting to some training without revealing the full extent of her abilities. Or she could be completely honest and deal with the consequences. I have extensive martial arts training, she said finally. My uncle is a former military instructor, and I've been learning self-defense since I was 8 years old. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying Kira with new interest. That explains the how. Now I'd like to understand the why. According to the witnesses I've spoken with so far, you were outnumbered 3-1. Most students in that situation would have tried to de-escalate or find a way to leave. I tried both of those things, Kira replied. They blocked my path and made it clear that leaving wasn't an option unless I submitted to public humiliation. When Marcus grabbed me, I defended myself. Grabbed you how? Kira demonstrated the reaching motion that had preceded the confrontation. He was trying to force me to kneel down and apologize to Jessica Torres for being rude in chemistry class. When I refused, he reached for my shoulder to physically force me into that position. Mrs. Rodriguez made notes as Kira spoke, her expression revealing nothing about whether she found the explanation credible. Miss Valdez, fighting on school grounds is typically grounds for suspension, regardless of the circumstances. However, I'm going to review the security footage before making any decisions about disciplinary action. She paused, looking directly into Kira's eyes. I'm also going to tell you something that isn't commonly known. Roosevelt High has had issues with certain students using intimidation and social pressure to control their classmates. The administration has been looking for ways to address this problem, but it's difficult when the incidents typically involve popular students with influential parents and victims who are too afraid to come forward. Kira waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. What I witnessed today, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, was 3 students with a history of bullying behavior getting a lesson in consequences. While I can't officially endorse vigilante justice, I can tell you that their victims haven't always had your ability to defend themselves. She stood up from her desk and moved to the window overlooking the main courtyard. The security footage will confirm your version of events, Miss Valdez. You were surrounded, blocked from leaving, and physically grabbed before you responded with force. Under our zero-tolerance policy, all 4 students involved should be suspended. However, I'm inclined to view your actions as legitimate self-defense. Kira felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez. Don't thank me yet, the assistant principal said, turning back to face her. Your ability to defend yourself is impressive, but it's also going to make you a target. Students like Marcus, Tyler, and Ashley don't handle humiliation well, and their friends won't appreciate seeing them taken down by someone they consider beneath their social status. I understand. Do you? Because what happened today is going to change everything about your experience at this school. You can't go back to being invisible now. Every phone in that hallway was recording by the end of your confrontation, and that footage is already spreading on social media. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Millfield will know that the quiet new girl at Roosevelt High is someone to be feared. Mrs. Rodriguez returned to her desk and pulled out a form from her drawer. I'm going to document this incident as mutual combat initiated by the 3 students who confronted you. They'll receive 3-day suspensions for fighting and intimidation. You'll receive a formal warning and mandatory anger management counseling, which is the lightest consequence I can justify, given that you hospitalized no one and used what appears to be appropriate force. She handed Kira the form to sign. However, I want to be very clear about something. Your training makes you a potential weapon on this campus. If you use excessive force against another student, if you initiate a confrontation, or if you hurt someone more seriously than necessary to defend yourself, you will be expelled and potentially face criminal charges. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. Good. Now, do you have somewhere safe to go for the rest of the day? Because I suspect that Trinity's friends are going to be looking for opportunities to even the score. Kira considered the question. Her parents were both at work, and returning to classes would mean facing the curiosity and potential hostility of students who had heard about the fight. "I could go home early," she said. "I think that would be wise. I'll mark you as excused for medical reasons." Mrs. Rodriguez signed the form and handed Kira a hall pass. "Miss Valdez, one more thing. If you experience any retaliation for today's incident, I want you to report it immediately. What those 3 students did to you was wrong, and they deserved consequences, but I don't want this situation to escalate into something more serious." As Kira gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, Mrs. Rodriguez added, "And Miss Valdez, despite the circumstances, I'm impressed by your restraint. Most people with your abilities would have done significantly more damage." Kira walked home through quiet suburban streets, her mind processing the implications of what had just occurred. The carefully constructed anonymity she had maintained for 3 weeks was completely destroyed. By the time she returned to school tomorrow, everyone would know her name, her capabilities, and her willingness to use violence when cornered. The protective invisibility that had served her at previous schools was gone forever. Her phone began buzzing with notifications as she walked, social media alerts and text messages from numbers she didn't recognize. She turned off the device without reading them, knowing that engaging with the inevitable speculation and commentary would only make things worse. At home, she found a note from her mother explaining that she would be working a double shift at the hospital and wouldn't be home until late. Her father's construction crew was finishing a project across town, and he wouldn't return until evening. For the first time since moving to Millfield, Kira was grateful for her parents' demanding work schedules. She needed time to think, without having to explain why she was home early or deflect questions about her day. She changed out of her school clothes and headed to the garage, where her father had helped her set up a small training area with a heavy bag, floor mats, and basic equipment. Physical exercise had always been her primary method for processing stress and anxiety, and today's events had left her with enough of both to fuel hours of training. As she began working through familiar combinations on the heavy bag, Kira allowed herself to truly consider what had happened. For 9 years, she had trained for the possibility of defending herself against multiple attackers. She had practiced techniques for escaping grabs, neutralizing larger opponents, and maintaining control in chaotic situations. But she had never imagined using those skills in a high school hallway surrounded by classmates with camera phones. The efficiency with which she had disabled Marcus, Tyler, and Ashley was both satisfying and troubling. Satisfying because they had deserved consequences for their attempted humiliation. Troubling because of how easily she could have seriously injured all 3 of them. The restraint Mrs. Rodriguez had praised was the result of constant mental discipline, the ongoing effort to use precisely the amount of force necessary to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. Her uncle had taught her that true martial arts mastery wasn't measured by the ability to inflict damage, but by the wisdom to know when and how much force was appropriate. Today had been a test of that principle, and she believed she had passed. But she also knew that her options for future conflicts had become significantly more limited. As evening approached and her parents returned home from work, Kira made the decision to tell them everything. Her father, Miguel Valdez, was a quiet man who had learned early in their relationship not to ask too many questions about his brother's military background or his methods for training Kira. Her mother, Carmen, was a practical woman who understood that their daughter's training was insurance against the dangers that could face a young woman in an unpredictable world. They listened without interruption as Kira described the events leading up to the confrontation, the incident itself, and her meeting with Mrs. Rodriguez. When she finished, the 3 of them sat in silence around their small kitchen table, each processing the implications of what had occurred. "Are you hurt?" Carmen asked finally, her mother's instincts overriding all other concerns. No, Kira replied. I wasn't touched. Miguel nodded slowly, his expression mixing pride with concern. You did what you had to do, Mija. But your mother and I knew this day would come eventually. We've been preparing for it. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a business card that Kira had never seen before. If there are any legal complications from today's incident, you call this number immediately. She's a lawyer who specializes in self-defense cases, and she understands situations involving trained fighters. Carmen squeezed Kira's hand across the table. We're proud of you for defending yourself, but we're also worried about what comes next. High school students can be cruel, and some of them have parents who don't like being shown up by someone they consider beneath their social status. Mrs. Rodriguez said the same thing, Kira admitted. She thinks there might be retaliation. Then we'll be ready for it, Miguel said firmly. But I want you to promise us something. No more holding back to protect your cover. If someone threatens you, if someone puts their hands on you, if someone tries to hurt you in any way, you respond with whatever force is necessary to protect yourself. Your safety is more important than keeping your abilities secret. The next morning, Kira arrived at Roosevelt High to find her world completely transformed. Students stopped talking when she walked past, some staring with obvious curiosity, others with barely concealed fear. Her locker was surrounded by a small crowd that dispersed quickly when she approached, but she could feel their eyes following her as she gathered her books for first period. The hallway where yesterday's confrontation had occurred was marked with yellow tape and a sign indicating it was temporarily closed for maintenance. Mrs. Rodriguez had clearly decided that removing physical reminders of the incident would help prevent copycat conflicts or memorial gathering spots. In her first period English class, Kira found that her usual seat near the back had been left conspicuously empty, with other students choosing desks farther away than they had previously. Her teacher, Mrs. Henson, greeted her normally but with a careful attention that suggested word of yesterday's events had spread throughout the faculty as well as the student body. The real change became apparent during the break between first and second periods. As Kira walked toward her chemistry class, she noticed that other students were creating space around her in the hallways. Some of this was clearly fear-based avoidance, but she was surprised to observe that some seemed to be showing a form of respect. Several underclassmen nodded at her as she passed, and she overheard whispered conversations that suggested her actions had resonated with students who had been victims of Trinity intimidation. "Did you see the video?" one sophomore was saying to her friend as Kira walked past their lockers. "She took all three of them down like it was nothing. I wish I could do that to the jerks who mess with me." "My cousin said Marcus was crying when they took him to the nurse," her friend replied. "Serves him right after what he did to that freshman last month." Chemistry class proved to be the first real test of how fundamentally things had changed. Jessica Torres was already seated when Kira entered, her designer sunglasses replaced by expensive makeup that couldn't quite conceal the red-rimmed eyes and blotchy complexion that suggested she had spent considerable time crying. She looked up when Kira walked in, and for a moment their eyes met across the classroom. Instead of the hatred or defiance Kira had expected to see, Jessica's expression contained something that looked remarkably like fear. She quickly looked away and spent the rest of the period staring determinedly at her textbook, never once glancing in Kira's direction. Mr. Patterson, who had witnessed their previous conflict, made a point of assigning them to different lab groups and keeping them on opposite sides of the classroom. His relief at avoiding another confrontation was almost palpable as he moved between student groups, carefully monitoring the general atmosphere for signs of tension. At lunch, Kira made her way to the cafeteria instead of the library, curious to see how the social dynamics had shifted overnight. The large room felt noticeably quieter when she entered, hundreds of conversations pausing as students turned to look at her. She selected food from the serving line while feeling the weight of all those stares, then looked around for a place to sit. The Trinity's usual table in the center of the room sat empty, its symbolic importance apparently diminished by the absence of its primary occupants. Several other tables had open seats, but the students at them seemed uncertain about whether to invite her to join them or maintain their distance. "Kira!" a voice called from near the windows. She turned to see Sofia Martinez, a junior she had spoken with briefly in her AP history class, waving her over to a table of students she recognized as members of the academic clubs and honor society. As she approached, Sofia stood up with a smile that seemed genuinely welcoming rather than fearful or calculating. "We saved you a seat," she said, gesturing to an empty chair. "I figured you might want to sit with people who appreciate what you did yesterday." The other students at the table nodded in agreement, and Kira felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to relax. These were clearly not Trinity supporters or students looking to exploit her newfound notoriety for social media content. "Thank you," Kira said, settling into the offered chair. "I wasn't sure where I was welcome." "You're welcome here," said David Kim, a senior she recognized from her calculus class. "Marcus and his friends have been terrorizing people at this school for years. It's about time someone stood up to them. My little brother is a freshman," added another girl named Rebecca. "He said kids in his class were actually smiling in the hallways today because they're not worried about getting shoved into lockers." As Kira ate lunch and listened to their conversation, she began to understand that yesterday's confrontation had implications far beyond her own situation. The Trinity had maintained their power through a carefully cultivated atmosphere of fear and social pressure. Her decisive victory over 3 of their members had shattered the illusion of their invincibility and given hope to students who had accepted harassment as an inevitable part of their high school experience. "The question now," Sophia said, lowering her voice slightly, "is what happens when they come back from suspension. Marcus isn't the kind of person who accepts humiliation gracefully." David nodded grimly. "And Brandon wasn't even there yesterday. He's going to take this personally, especially since it makes him look weak for not protecting his friends." Kira had been wondering about Brandon's absence during the hallway confrontation. As the Trinity's leader, his failure to appear when his friends were being humiliated would be seen as either strategic withdrawal or cowardly abandonment, neither of which would enhance his reputation. "Do you think they'll try something when they get back?" Rebecca asked. "Definitely," Sophia replied. "The only question is what and when." Kira listened to their speculation with growing concern. She had handled the immediate threat effectively, but the broader implications of challenging established power structures were becoming clear. The Trinity couldn't allow her actions to go unanswered without losing credibility, which meant some form of escalation was inevitable. That afternoon, as she walked home from school, Kira noticed a black BMW following at a distance behind her. The car stayed far enough back to avoid being obvious, but it matched her pace and made the same turns through the residential streets leading to her neighborhood. When she stopped at a corner and pretended to check her phone, the BMW pulled into a driveway and waited. Rather than continuing home and revealing her address, Kira changed course and headed toward the public library, a route that would take her through busier streets with more witnesses. The BMW continued following, confirming her suspicion that this was surveillance rather than coincidence. At the library, she sat in a window seat with a clear view of the parking lot and watched as Brandon Castellanos emerged from the BMW. Even at a distance, his body language radiated barely controlled anger as he paced beside his car, occasionally looking toward the library entrance. After 20 minutes of waiting, he got back in his car and drove away. Kira remained at the library until evening, using the time to research legal precedents for self-defense cases involving martial arts training. What she learned was not particularly encouraging. Trained fighters were often held to higher standards in court, with prosecutors arguing that their skills made them more dangerous and less justified in claiming self-defense. Several cases involved martial artists receiving heavier sentences than untrained defendants who had caused similar injuries. She also researched Brandon Castellanos and his family, finding newspaper articles about his father's construction company and their involvement in local politics. The family had significant influence in Millfield, with connections to city council members, the school board, and law enforcement. If Brandon decided to escalate their conflict beyond the school environment, Kira could find herself facing legal and social pressures that would be difficult to overcome. When she finally left the library after dark, she took a circuitous route home that allowed her to confirm she wasn't being followed. Her parents were waiting when she arrived, having heard from Mrs. Rodriguez about potential retaliation and the need for increased vigilance. "From now on," her father said, "one of us picks you up after school every day. No more walking home alone." "Miguel spoke with your uncle," her mother added. "He's going to come visit this weekend to assess the situation and help us decide how to handle it." Kira felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the news. Miguel Valdez was a formidable presence who had taught her everything she knew about combat and self-defense, but his involvement would also signal that her parents viewed the situation as genuinely dangerous rather than typical teenage drama. The rest of the week passed in a strange state of suspended tension. Marcus, Tyler, and Ashley remained on suspension, but their absence only seemed to increase the anticipation for their eventual return. Brandon made no direct approaches, but Kira often noticed him watching her from across the cafeteria or parking lot, his expression calculating and hostile. Other students' reactions continued to evolve as the initial shock of the confrontation faded. Some treated her with obvious fear, giving her wide berth in hallways and avoiding eye contact. Others seemed fascinated by her abilities, asking indirect questions about martial arts training and self-defense techniques. A small but growing group began treating her with the kind of respect typically reserved for seniors or star athletes. Most significantly, several students approached her privately to share their own experiences with Trinity intimidation. A sophomore named Alex described being forced to do other students' homework under threat of physical violence. A junior named Maya talked about having embarrassing photos shared on social media after refusing to attend a party with older students. A freshman named Connor had been systematically excluded from social activities and subjected to daily harassment that had driven him to consider transferring schools. These conversations helped Kira understand that her confrontation with Marcus, Tyler, and Ashley had been more than personal self-defense. She had inadvertently challenged a system of organized bullying that had affected dozens of students over several years. The implications of this realization were both empowering and frightening. Friday afternoon brought the news that everyone had been anticipating. Mrs. Rodriguez announced over the PA system that 3 students would be returning from suspension on Monday and that any incidents of retaliation or vigilante justice would be met with immediate expulsion. The carefully neutral language fooled no one. Everyone understood that the Trinity was coming back and that the administration expected trouble. That evening, Uncle Miguel arrived from Phoenix with a duffel bag and the kind of alert intensity that Kira remembered from her childhood training sessions. Miguel Valdez was in his late 40s, built like the soldier he had once been, with graying hair and scars that told stories he rarely shared. His presence filled their small house with an energy that made everything feel more serious and potentially dangerous. "Tell me everything," he said, after greeting his brother and sister-in-law. "Leave out nothing." Kira spent 2 hours recounting not just the events of the previous week, but the patterns of behavior she had observed, the students she had spoken with, and the research she had conducted about the Castellanos family's influence in the community. Miguel listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed his professional understanding of threat assessment and tactical planning. "You did well," he said finally. "Your technique was clean, your force was proportional, and your restraint was appropriate. But you're in a more complicated situation than you realize." He pulled out a tablet and showed them photographs he had taken during his drive through Millfield. "I've been observing this town for 6 hours. The Castellanos family doesn't just have influence here, they own significant portions of the local economy. Brandon's father employs directly or indirectly about 30% of the working population. The police chief attended high school with him. 2 school board members work for companies that depend on his construction contracts." Miguel set down the tablet and looked directly at Kira. "This means that if this situation escalates beyond student conflicts, you won't be fighting just Brandon and his friends. You'll be fighting an entire power structure that has strong incentives to protect their interests." Carmen gripped her husband's hand tightly. "What are you saying? That Kira can't defend herself?" "I'm saying that self-defense has legal, social, and political dimensions that most people never consider," Miguel replied. "Kira has the skills to protect herself physically, but if she's forced to seriously injure someone from a powerful family, the consequences could follow her for years." He turned back to Kira. "Which is why we're going to make sure that doesn't happen." Over the weekend, Miguel transformed their garage into a tactical planning center. He had Kira demonstrate the techniques she had used against Marcus, Tyler, and Ashley, critiquing her form and suggesting improvements. He also introduced new concepts, situational awareness protocols for identifying potential threats, de-escalation strategies for avoiding conflicts when possible, and escape routes for the school campus that would allow her to reach safety if cornered. Most importantly, he helped her understand the psychological dynamics that would drive Brandon's response to the humiliation of his friends. "He can't let this stand," Miguel explained. "His entire identity is built on being feared and respected. Your victory over his lieutenants makes him look weak, which undermines his power over other students." "So, what will he do?" Kira asked. "He'll escalate incrementally, testing your responses and looking for weaknesses. First, he'll try psychological pressure, spreading rumors, social isolation, making you feel unwelcome and unsafe. If that doesn't work, he'll move to indirect physical intimidation, vandalism, harassment of your friends, situations where he can claim plausible deniability." Miguel pulled up a map of the school on his tablet. "Only if those tactics fail will he risk direct confrontation. And when that happens, he'll make sure he has overwhelming advantages. Multiple attackers, weapons, or a situation where you can't effectively defend yourself." "How do I prepare for that?" "By making sure it never happens," Miguel replied. "The best fight is the one you never have to fight. But if avoidance becomes impossible, you end it quickly and decisively, with enough force to ensure there won't be a second attempt." Sunday evening, as Miguel prepared to return to Phoenix, he gave Kira a small device that looked like a car key fob. "Personal alarm," he explained, 130 decibel siren that will bring every adult within 3 blocks running. Use it if you're ever outnumbered or in a situation where you can't escape." He also handed her a business card, identical to the one her father had shown her earlier. "Laura Hendricks, attorney. She's expecting your call if anything happens. Don't talk to police, administrators, or anyone else without her present. Understand?" "I understand." "Good. Remember, Mija, you have nothing to prove to these people. You've already shown them that you won't be a victim. Now you just need to get through the next 7 months and graduate." Monday morning arrived with an atmosphere of anticipation that was almost electric. Students gathered in small groups throughout the campus, speculating about what would happen when the suspended Trinity members returned. Some expressed hope that the humiliation would moderate their behavior, while others predicted escalation and retaliation. Kira arrived early, driven by her father, and made her way to her locker through hallways that felt more crowded than usual. Everyone seemed to be watching, waiting for the moment when the suspended students would make their entrance and the next phase of the conflict would begin. The first sign of their return came during second period, when whispers began spreading through her AP history class that Marcus had been seen in the parking lot. By third period, confirmed sightings placed all 3 suspended students back on campus, though none had been spotted in the main hallways where their humiliation had occurred. At lunch, Kira joined Sophia and her friends at their usual table, grateful for the normalcy of their conversation about upcoming exams and college applications, but even their academic focus couldn't completely mask the underlying tension as they occasionally glanced toward the Trinity's empty table and speculated about when their former occupants would make their appearance. The answer came during fourth period, when Kira was walking to her calculus class through the main hallway. She rounded a corner and found herself facing Marcus, Tyler, and Ashley for the first time since their confrontation. They were standing near the science wing entrance with several other students she recognized as Trinity supporters, effectively blocking the route to her classroom. Marcus looked pale and thinner than she remembered, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Tyler's nose was slightly crooked, presumably from their encounter, and he kept one hand pressed protectively against his ribs. Ashley had concealed most of her facial bruising with makeup, but the swelling around her left eye was still visible. "Well, look who it is," Marcus said as Kira approached. His voice carried less confidence than before, but the hostility was unmistakable. The famous new girl. Kira stopped several feet away, maintaining distance while assessing the positions of the surrounding students. There were at least 8 of them, too many to fight effectively even with her training. Several had their phones out, ready to record whatever happened next. "I need to get to class," she said simply. "Do you?" Ashley stepped forward, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "Because I think we need to have a conversation first, about what happened last week." "What happened last week was you and your friends cornered me and tried to force me to humiliate myself," Kira replied. "When you made it physical, I defended myself. End of story." Tyler cracked his knuckles, the sound carrying despite the noise of the crowded hallway. "You think it's over? You think you can just attack us and walk away like nothing happened?" "I think I'm going to be late for class if this continues," Kira said, reaching into her pocket to grasp the personal alarm Miguel had given her. "And I think you should consider whether you really want to test my willingness to defend myself again." The standoff stretched for several seconds, neither side willing to back down, but both aware of the potential consequences of escalation. Finally, Marcus stepped aside with obvious reluctance. "This isn't over," he said as Kira walked past. "Not even close." She made it to calculus class with seconds to spare, her heart racing from the confrontation, but her hands steady as she took notes on derivatives and integration. The encounter had been exactly what Miguel had predicted: psychological pressure designed to make her feel unwelcome and unsafe without crossing lines that would result in administrative intervention. After school, as her father picked her up in the parking lot, Kira noticed the black BMW following them again. This time, Brandon wasn't alone. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, and she could see at least 2 other figures in the back seat. They maintained their distance, but made no effort to hide their surveillance, sending a clear message about their ongoing interest in her activities. "They're following us," she told her father as they drove through downtown Millfield. Miguel glanced in the rearview mirror and nodded grimly. "I see them. We're going to take a little detour." Instead of heading home, he drove to the police station and parked directly in front of the main entrance. The BMW continued past without slowing, but Kira caught a clear glimpse of Brandon's face as they drove by. His expression was coldly furious, the look of someone who had been denied something he considered rightfully his. "Why did we come here?" Kira asked. "To establish a record," her father replied. "If they're going to escalate this situation, I want documentation that they were following and intimidating you. Officer Martinez is an old friend who owes me some favors." They spent 30 minutes inside the police station, filing a report about the surveillance and providing photographs of the BMW that Miguel had taken with his phone. Officer Martinez listened sympathetically and promised to increase patrols near their house and the school, but his expression suggested he was aware of the political complications that surrounded any investigation involving the Castellanos family. The next few days followed a pattern of low-level harassment that was clearly coordinated but carefully designed to avoid triggering administrative intervention. Kira's locker was vandalized with permanent marker that maintenance had to remove with industrial solvents. Her tires were deflated in the school parking lot, though no damage was done that would constitute destruction of property. Anonymous social media accounts began spreading rumors about her family's immigration status, her academic performance, and her alleged history of violence at previous schools. Most disturbingly, several of the students who had approached her about Trinity harassment began avoiding her in hallways and withdrawing from conversations. When she asked Sophia about this change, her friend looked uncomfortable. "Some people have been getting pressure," Sophia admitted. "Nothing direct, but word is going around that being seen with you could be problematic." "What kind of pressure?" "The usual stuff. Social exclusion, rumors, having your pictures tagged on social media with nasty comments. Ashley has been particularly creative with her psychological warfare." Kira felt a surge of anger at the realization that her conflict with the Trinity was affecting innocent students who had simply shown her kindness. This was exactly the kind of collateral damage that made her situation more complicated than simple self-defense. "I'm sorry," she said. "I never wanted anyone else to get caught up in this." Sophia shook her head firmly. "Don't apologize for standing up to bullies. The problem isn't you, it's them. But you should know that not everyone is backing down. Some of us think it's time someone challenged their power." That afternoon, as Kira was gathering her books from her locker, she found a note that had been slipped through the vents. The message was brief and unsigned. "Library. After school. Come alone." Every instinct Miguel had trained into her screamed that this was a trap, but her curiosity overcame her caution. The library closed at 4 p.m., 30 minutes after classes ended, which would limit the time available for any confrontation. She decided to investigate while remaining ready to leave immediately if the situation felt dangerous. The library was nearly empty when she arrived, with only a few students working on homework at scattered tables. She found Brandon sitting alone in the back corner, away from the main desk where the librarian could observe them. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Kira remained standing, keeping the table between them while scanning for exit routes and potential witnesses. "What do you want?" "To talk. Without an audience, without my friends, without the pressure of maintaining reputations." Brandon's voice was calm, almost conversational, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he held his hands. "So, talk. You humiliated 3 of my friends in front of half the school. You made me look weak for not protecting them. You've disrupted a social order that has worked fine for years." He paused, studying her face. "But you also did something that I have to respect." Kira waited, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "You stood up for yourself when you were outnumbered and facing superior social position. You used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat without causing permanent damage. You didn't gloat afterward or try to build your own reputation on their humiliation." Brandon leaned forward slightly. "Those are the actions of someone with real strength, not just physical skills. Is this leading somewhere?" "Yes. I'm offering you a choice." Brandon's expression became more serious. "You can join us, accept the respect you've earned, become part of the social structure here instead of fighting against it. Your abilities would be appreciated, your status would be protected, and this conflict would end." Kira felt a moment of genuine surprise. Whatever she had expected from this meeting, a recruitment offer hadn't been on the list. "And if I refuse?" Brandon's smile was cold and perfectly controlled. "Then we continue our current path until one of us wins decisively. But I want you to understand what that means before you decide." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph of her parents leaving the hospital where her mother worked. "Your family has built a nice life here. Your father's construction crew speaks highly of him. Your mother is well regarded by her colleagues. It would be unfortunate if circumstances forced them to relocate again." The threat was delivered with calm professionalism, but its implications hit Kira like a physical blow. Brandon wasn't just threatening her, he was threatening the people she cared about most. "You're talking about destroying my family's livelihood because you can't handle being challenged by a teenage girl," she said, keeping her voice level despite the rage building in her chest. "I'm talking about the way power actually works in small communities," Brandon replied. "My family has influence here. We have connections, relationships, obligations. If you continue to be a problem, those connections will be used to solve that problem." Kira felt the familiar calm settling over her, the mental state that preceded violence. But she also remembered Miguel's warnings about escalation and consequences. Fighting Brandon in the library would solve nothing and potentially create larger problems. "I need time to think about it," she said. "Of course. But don't take too long. My patience isn't unlimited, and neither is my ability to control what my friends might do if they get tired of waiting for resolution." As Kira left the library, her mind was racing with the implications of Brandon's offer and threat. The choice he had presented was brutally simple: join the system that oppressed other students or watch her family suffer the consequences of her defiance. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that her uncle had warned her about. That evening, she called Miguel and recounted the entire conversation. His response was immediate and unequivocal. "You cannot negotiate with terrorists," he said. "And that's what this boy is. A terrorist who uses fear and economic pressure instead of bombs. If you give in to his demands now, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering when the next ultimatum will arrive." "But what about Mom and Dad? What if he can really destroy their jobs?" "Then we deal with that when it happens. Your parents knew the risks when we decided to teach you to defend yourself. They would rather face economic hardship than watch you become the kind of person who enables bullies through cowardice." Miguel's words provided some comfort, but Kira knew that the stakes had escalated beyond simple school conflicts. She was now facing a choice between her principles and her family's security, with no guarantee that either option would lead to a satisfactory resolution. The next morning brought evidence that Brandon's threats weren't empty. Kira's father received a call from his supervisor explaining that his crew had been reassigned to a different project and that his services might not be needed for the remainder of the week. Her mother was informed that several of her shifts had been cancelled due to budget restructuring that would affect staffing levels. Both parents handled the news with remarkable calm, but Kira could see the stress in their faces and the worried conversations they had when they thought she wasn't listening. The economic pressure was real and immediate, exactly as Brandon had promised. At school, the Trinity's harassment campaign intensified. Kira found obscene graffiti about her family on bathroom walls, received anonymous text messages containing threats and personal information that shouldn't have been accessible to students, and discovered that someone had been spreading rumors about her immigration status that led to uncomfortable questions from classmates. Most concerning was the systematic isolation being imposed on anyone who showed her support. Sophia apologized tearfully as she explained that her college recommendation letters had been threatened if she continued associating with troublemakers. David Kim found himself excluded from study groups and academic clubs that were essential for his own college applications. Rebecca discovered that her part-time job at a local restaurant owned by Trinity supporters had suddenly become unavailable. Kira watched helplessly as students who had shown her kindness paid the price for their decency. The realization that her principles were causing harm to innocent people was more painful than any physical confrontation she had ever experienced. Thursday afternoon, as she sat alone in the cafeteria for the first time since the original confrontation, Brandon approached her table with the confident stride of someone who knew he was winning. "Have you had enough time to think?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her without invitation. "I'm still considering my options," Kira replied. "Let me help clarify them for you. Your father's construction company has decided they don't need his services after all. Your mother's hospital is implementing budget cuts that will eliminate several nursing positions. Your few remaining friends are discovering that supporting you carries costs they can't afford." Brandon leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conversational whisper. "This can all stop today. One word from me and your parents get their jobs back. Your friends stop facing retaliation. You get to finish senior year as part of the winning team instead of as a pariah. And all I have to do is help you intimidate other students? All you have to do is stop fighting a system that's bigger than you are." Brandon's smile was genuinely warm, the expression of someone offering salvation rather than surrender. "You've proven your point, Kira. You've shown everyone that you're not weak. Now show them that you're smart." Kira stared at him across the table, recognizing the sophisticated manipulation at work, but also acknowledging the very real consequences he was describing. Her parents had sacrificed stability and security to give her opportunities, and now their kindness to her was being turned against them. "I need one more day," she said finally. "Of course, but tomorrow is Friday, and I'd like to start the weekend with this situation resolved." That evening, Kira found herself in the garage with her parents and Uncle Miguel, who had driven back from Phoenix after learning about the economic pressure being applied to their family. The four of them sat in chairs arranged around the heavy bag, an impromptu family meeting in the space where Kira had learned to defend herself. "We could leave," Carmen said quietly. "Move again. Start over somewhere else. Miguel knows people in other states who could help us find work." "Running away teaches the wrong lesson," Miguel replied firmly. "And there's no guarantee this boy's family doesn't have connections in other places. Powerful people know other powerful people." "So what do you suggest?" Miguel asked. "That we let them destroy our lives because our daughter refused to become a bully?" "I suggest we end this situation permanently," Miguel said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Kira has been reactive since this started, responding to their moves instead of making her own. It's time to change that dynamic." He pulled out a folder containing photographs and documents he had gathered during his investigation of the Castellanos family. "Brandon thinks he holds all the cards because his family has money and local influence. But powerful people always have vulnerabilities, and I found several that might be useful." The photographs showed Brandon drinking at parties with other underage students, documentation of his father's construction company violating safety regulations, and evidence of the systematic harassment campaign being coordinated through social media accounts that could be traced back to Trinity members. "You're talking about blackmail," Carmen said. "I'm talking about mutually assured destruction," Miguel corrected, making it clear that escalating this conflict will cost them more than they're willing to pay. "And if that doesn't work?" Miguel's expression became grimmer. Then we make sure the next confrontation is definitive enough that there won't be a need for another one. Friday morning, Kira arrived at school with a clear plan and the calm confidence that came from having made a difficult decision. She had spent the night reviewing everything Miguel had taught her about strategy, tactics, and the psychology of conflict resolution. Today would determine whether she spent the rest of senior year as Brandon's subordinate or as someone who had permanently ended his ability to threaten her family. She found Brandon waiting by her locker, flanked by Marcus and Tyler, their presence clearly intended to intimidate her into compliance. The hallway around them was crowded with students who sensed that this encounter would be significant, phones already out and recording as they anticipated either capitulation or escalation. "Good morning, Kira," Brandon said with the warm smile of someone who expected to hear surrender. "I hope you've reached a decision that benefits everyone involved." "I have," she replied, maintaining eye contact while assessing the positions of his supporters and identifying potential weapons in the surrounding environment. "But first, I want to make sure you understand the terms of what you're offering." "Of course. You want me to use my abilities to help you intimidate other students, to be part of a system that destroys people's confidence and makes them afraid to defend themselves." Kira's voice carried clearly through the now silent hallway. "In exchange, you'll stop using your family's influence to punish mine." Brandon's smile faltered slightly as he realized she was speaking for the benefit of their audience rather than negotiating privately. That's a very dramatic way to describe a simple social arrangement. Is it? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're offering to stop hurting innocent people if I agree to help you hurt different innocent people. Kira pulled out her phone and held it up so Brandon could see the screen. "I spent last night thinking about your offer, and I realized something important." The screen showed a photograph of Brandon drinking beer at a party, clearly underage and obviously intoxicated. "You're not as powerful as you think you are." Brandon's expression darkened as he recognized the image. "Where did you get that?" "From the same place I got these," Kira said, swiping to additional photographs showing various Trinity members engaged in illegal activities, documentation of harassment campaigns, and evidence of systematic rule violations that would interest both school administrators and law enforcement. "You're threatening me." Brandon's voice had lost its warmth, revealing the anger that always lay beneath his polished exterior. "I'm explaining the terms of my counteroffer," Kira replied calmly. "You and your friends stop harassing me, stop retaliating against my family, and stop intimidating other students. In return, this information stays private, and you get to finish senior year without facing criminal charges or expulsion." Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "You can't prove any of that stuff." "Actually, I can. Your social media accounts aren't as private as you think, and your harassment campaign has been thoroughly documented." Kira gestured toward the surrounding students, "including witnesses who are tired of being afraid." Several underclassmen in the crowd nodded, and she saw expressions of hope beginning to replace fear on faces that had grown accustomed to intimidation. Brandon's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "You think you can threaten me? Me? Do you have any idea who my family is? What we can do to you?" "I know exactly who your family is," Kira replied. "I also know that your father's construction company has been cutting corners on safety regulations, that your family's political connections won't protect you from federal investigations, and that bad publicity can destroy even well-established businesses." She swiped to another image on her phone, this one showing safety violations at a Castellanos construction site. The local newspaper would be very interested in a story about a wealthy family using their influence to intimidate students while endangering workers. The hallway had become completely silent, except for the sound of phones recording and the faint hum of the ventilation system. Every student present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would define the remainder of their high school experience. Brandon looked around at the crowd, recognizing that his options had become severely limited. Any physical response would be captured on dozens of phones and would validate everything Kira had just accused him of. But backing down publicly would destroy the reputation that had taken years to build. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Yes, it is," Kira replied firmly. "Because if it isn't, if you or your friends retaliate against me or anyone else, all of this information goes public immediately. Your choice." She closed her phone and shouldered her backpack, then looked directly into Brandon's eyes. "I tried to avoid this conflict. I tried to stay invisible and just get through senior year without causing problems. But you and your friends decided that wasn't acceptable. You forced this confrontation, and now you get to live with the consequences." As she walked away, the crowd parted to let her pass, and she could hear excited whispers beginning as students processed what they had just witnessed. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High, Kira felt like she could breathe freely in the hallways. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation exceeded even Kira's optimistic expectations. By lunchtime, video clips of her exchange with Brandon had spread throughout the school and beyond, shared on social media platforms and discussed in excited conversations that continued for days. The documentation she had threatened to release never became necessary. The public humiliation of being challenged so decisively was sufficient to neutralize Brandon's willingness to continue their conflict. More importantly, the systematic harassment that had affected dozens of students began to disappear almost immediately. Without the Trinity's coordination and intimidation, the various smaller bullies and opportunists who had participated in their campaigns lost their protection and their motivation. Students who had been afraid to eat in the cafeteria, participate in extracurricular activities, or simply walk through certain hallways began reclaiming spaces that had been denied to them. Sophia and her friends returned to their regular interactions with Kira, apologizing for their temporary abandonment and expressing amazement at how quickly the school's social atmosphere had changed. David Kim reported that his study groups and academic clubs had welcomed him back without explanation or acknowledgement that he had ever been excluded. Rebecca discovered that her part-time job was available again, with a raise that suggested her employer was embarrassed about their previous behavior. Most significantly, Kira's parents found that their work situations had resolved themselves as quickly as they had deteriorated. Her father's construction supervisor called to explain that the project reassignment had been temporary and that his crew was needed for a significant new contract that would provide steady employment through the winter. Her mother learned that the hospital's budget restructuring had been cancelled and that several additional shifts were available if she was interested in overtime pay. The speed and completeness of these reversals confirmed that Brandon's family had indeed been responsible for the economic pressure, but also demonstrated that their influence could be withdrawn as easily as it had been applied. The implicit message was clear. As long as the conflict remained resolved, there would be no further retaliation. 3 weeks later, Kira found herself in an unexpected position of prominence at Roosevelt High. Students who had never spoken to her before sought her advice about dealing with conflicts, asked questions about self-defense training, and invited her to social events that she had previously been excluded from. Teachers commented favorably on the improved classroom atmosphere and the reduced number of disciplinary incidents they were required to handle. Most surprisingly, she received an invitation to join the Peer Mediation Program, a school initiative designed to help students resolve conflicts without administrative intervention. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had handled the original disciplinary proceedings, suggested that Kira's unique experience and demonstrated restraint made her an ideal candidate for helping other students navigate difficult social situations. What you did, Mrs. Rodriguez explained during their meeting, was demonstrate that strength doesn't require cruelty and that conflicts can be resolved through courage rather than violence. Those are exactly the qualities we want peer mediators to model. As autumn progressed toward winter, Kira found herself settling into a routine that would have been impossible during her first weeks at Roosevelt High. She ate lunch with a diverse group of friends who valued her friendship rather than fearing her abilities. She participated in academic clubs and extracurricular activities without worrying about attracting the wrong kind of attention. She walked through hallways with her head up, making eye contact and engaging in conversations like a normal teenager. The Trinity continued to attend Roosevelt High, but their influence had been permanently diminished. Brandon maintained his academic performance and college preparations, but avoided interactions with underclassmen and seemed to have lost interest in social dominance. Marcus and Tyler kept to themselves, no longer seeking opportunities to intimidate or harass other students. Jessica remained popular among her original friend group, but had stopped using social media as a weapon against perceived rivals. Most importantly for Kira, she had learned to integrate her martial arts training with her daily life in a way that enhanced rather than complicated her relationships. Students who knew about her abilities respected them without fearing them, understanding that her strength was defensive rather than aggressive. She began teaching informal self-defense workshops for interested classmates, sharing techniques for avoiding and escaping dangerous situations while emphasizing the responsibility that came with any form of power. During winter break, Uncle Miguel visited to assess how the situation had evolved and to continue Kira's training with more advanced techniques. He expressed pride in her handling of the conflict, but also used their time together to discuss the broader implications of what she had experienced. "You've learned something that many people never understand," he said, as they worked through combinations on the heavy bag. "Real power isn't the ability to hurt others. It's the ability to protect what matters without becoming the kind of person you despise." "It felt wrong sometimes," Kira admitted, "using fear against them, even when they deserved it." "That's how you know you're still a good person," Miguel replied. "The moment it starts feeling easy or enjoyable is the moment you need to step back and reconsider your methods." As senior year continued, Kira found herself looking forward to graduation not as an escape from Roosevelt High, but as a natural conclusion to a transformative experience. She had entered the school as a frightened transfer student determined to remain invisible and avoid complications. She would leave as a confident young woman who understood both her own strength and her responsibility to use it wisely. The bullies who had tried to slap the new girl's cheek had indeed made a big mistake, but not in the way they could have anticipated. Their attempt to humiliate and control her had instead created an opportunity for growth, learning, and positive change that extended far beyond their original conflict. In trying to make her a victim, they had accidentally helped her become a leader, and for Kira Valdez, that transformation was worth more than any revenge could ever have been.